Language has power. The way we talk about an issue influences the way we think about that issue. And the way we think about an issue influences the solutions we imagine are possible. Consider some of our common metaphors. Our time is money, a commodity with a price tag. We might think of a relationship as a journey, and we might wonder where ours is going. Language also has power when it comes to another issue, one we've been talking about on the show, and that's housing affordability. Words matter, and someone who's spent a great deal of time educating others about this is Dr. Tiffany Manuel. Dr. T, as people call her, has spent 25 years training people in how to make the case for a more just, equitable world. She's the president and CEO of The Case Made, which works with social justice movements by revealing the evidence-based principles that underpin them. And she's worked on this issue in Metro Atlanta, advising ARC on the Metro Atlanta housing strategy and working with a community-led process around housing affordability in Sandy Springs. And she's here with us today to talk about some of the principles that underlie what we talk about when we talk about housing affordability. This is What's Next ATL, powered by the Atlanta Regional Commission, where we explore the big ideas shaping Metro Atlanta. I'm Kate Sweeney, and let's just get into it. My conversation with Dr. Tiffany Manuel. Dr. T, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You work on a whole host of issues. What makes housing affordability particularly notable or particularly fraught when it comes to how we think and talk about it?
Yeah, I'm interested in a whole range of issues. And my firm, we work on everything from education to economic mobility, to housing, to climate change, any of those things that really, from our vantage point, require a lens around justice. But to your point, Kate, I think, housing has a special place in the work that I do, and certainly the work that I see happening around the country. One, because housing is so central to everything about our lives and the success of our lives, but we rarely pay enough attention to it. It's almost like the sort of air we breathe, the ground under our feet. We often don't really think about what it takes as a society to make sure that housing is available for everybody. People think about it as a consumer good, not as something that we work on together that needs collective problem solving, that is a public policy issue to solve. And so housing just represented like the toughest nut to crack because people think about their house as their equity. It's their nest egg, it's their retirement, it's the place where most folks have their wealth. And so that, right, like, listen, I'm willing to have a conversation about a great deal of social issues, but don't mess with my nest egg, like that's the thing I got to retire on, that's all that people have. And so that takes a special significance.
Oh, there's so much to unpack there. But let's start here. Let's talk about some of the actual ways we do talk about this issue and how they get in the way, as you say, of being productive when it comes to making real change for the better. One place to get started is simply the use of the term affordable housing. I have not heard you say affordable housing. What are your thoughts on that term?
Yeah. So thank you for noticing that. I would say one of the things we learned early on and doing some of the early, I would say, research is that there's just such negative associations with affordable housing. When you just say that as a term, the way that people think about that, even today, when so many people actually could use and would actually qualify for quote unquote affordable housing, just the negative conception of, number one, who benefits from so-called affordable housing, what it looks like, where it's located. And just think about this. Nobody goes to bed at night dreaming about, or I should say, very few people go to bed at night dreaming about like, I want to live in affordable housing when I grow up, right? Nobody says that. They certainly may say, I want a home. But when people think about affordable housing, that's not what they're dreaming about. That's not the American quote unquote dream. And so the challenge for us in the field is we are saddled with a term that comes with a whole lot of negative baggage. And so usually what we counsel folks to do is to reframe that, to talk about the affordability of housing or housing affordability, right? And sometimes we'll even say, don't even use the word housing. Even that sounds clinical. Nobody grows up saying, I want to live in housing, right? You want to live in a home. You want to be in a place that you love, that where your family could grow up.
Right. And not to belabor the point, but just to be clear, when I think of the term affordable housing, honestly, what pops into my head are government subsidized towers.
Exactly. Actually, can I address that even
Yes.
more? Yeah, because I think when people, the other thing that we know about when people have this conception, whether they will say it or not, when you say affordable housing, that comes with a set of assumptions about who is going to live there. And nine times out of
Right.
10, the vision of who's going to live there are people of color, right? With lots of kids. You think of the traditional sort of welfare queen, even if you don't speak it, and so that becomes a huge challenge too. People say, I don't want to live next to affordable housing because they're thinking about, right, the sort of racialized, genderized idea of what that means. And that becomes a challenge for us too. It's also one of the reasons I think that this sort of racial equity lens has to be embedded in our conversations, because even if you don't bring it up, because of the way that people think about affordable housing and the assumptions they have about who that housing serves, race is in the center of that conversation. And so, one of the things that I've done as part of my practice and with a lot of the clients that we have is to work through how to raise that as a conversation constructively so that it doesn't backfire on you, but you actually get a more constructive way to have people actually process their conception of what this means, and to process what race means in this context.
And then another thing which seems related to me is housing being part of the American dream, which is this idea that, hey, if things are too expensive for you in our community, why don't you just move someplace else, someplace that you can afford? And that seems very much to me related to this equity idea that you've started to bring in this conversation.
Absolutely. We have a strong narrative in this country around mobility. So when you are in a place that's not working for you, we have a whole history and folklore in our culture about moving. For lots of folks that came to this country, some of them said, hey, we think there's an even better life going out west. Or for African Americans in the South after Reconstruction, right, found their way to the North where they thought they could have a better life. So we have that narrative in our culture over and over and over again that if you're living in a place where things are not going well for you, it's your responsibility to move. Like that's almost like a knee-jerk like reaction. You go to the doctor and they test your reflexes. There are narratives and metaphors that have come to shape the way we think about the world, and we filter all the new information that comes in through those narratives and those metaphors that we've heard over and over and over again. That's why the language you use is so important. So at least we don't trigger some of these narratives that are just very unhelpful.
So, how do we motivate people to really work for housing affordability without overwhelming them? Because on the face of it, it sure doesn't seem obvious.
So I think you're right. Right. Nobody comes home from work and says, oh my God, it's crazy what's happening out here. They got some new affordable house, some new accessory dwellings. We got to get to that meeting. Crazy what's happening out here in these streets. Like very few people come home from a long day of their own lives and their own work and are excited about what they consider to be solving the affordable housing issues of other people, especially in the context of the moment that we're living in. Folks are going through a lot of things. And so what you want to do is to figure out what are the aspirations of the people around you, what they want to live in a community that is healthy, that's thriving. If you listen to folks, they'll tell you, I want to have some assuredness of the success of my kids. I want to be able to retire with a decent nest egg and not have to struggle. Like, so when you tie this issue of affordable housing to those concerns, then you get people who want to come out right to that meeting, because now this issue about affordable housing is not just about those people in that other neighborhood over there. It's about all of us and how I get to the point where, right, I know that my kids have a future in this city.
I mean, housing affordability is something that I think it's really easy for folks to feel helpless about because it seems really big, and like there's this idea out there that the only folks with the power to make any change are like developers, and then there are policymakers.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Even the way we talk about these issues makes it feel so big that it's unsolvable. We thought many years ago that the way to get people really interested in thinking about the urgency of this was to start talking about the huge numbers of people that are affected by this issue. So you could say in Atlanta today, there 100,000 families who are housing cost burdened, spending more than 30% of their income for housing, and there are all these kids, and there's this and that. And we would lift up these big numbers because we thought that when you did that, people would say, oh my God, we got to solve this. Look at those big numbers. And it turns out that when you do that, you actually push people away in very much the way you were just describing that. Then it gets so big, it feels so big, you can't possibly solve that. Listen, I just go to work every day and come home and like try to fix dinner for my kids. There's no way I'm able to solve that. One of the answers to that is to begin to start to unpack that, not to mislead folks in terms of what the need is, but to say every community in Atlanta, right, needs to do its fair share. And so it may turn out that in one community, what's possible is adding, a couple hundred units of affordable housing over the next couple of years. Okay, that's fine. So when you break those numbers down like that, it feels much more doable. Like, okay, we could probably do that. The other thing I want to take on what you said was really true as well, is that there are lots of folks in the housing space who have found it important to kind of create or talk about the villains in the story. And a part of this comes from this sort of storytelling, motif where people say, you've got the heroines in the story, you got to get people a villain to fight. And so they try and identify who the villains are. And most likely they usually are developers. They can be also often big corporations.
But also like every Scooby-Doo cartoon.
Yeah.
The developer is the villain. You pull the mask off and it's the developer.
Exactly. You got it. Or it's the policymakers. What I would say to you is that it's totally counterproductive for many reasons. Number one, the larger scale developers, the folks that you are making the villains in the stories, are the only ones who really have the capacity to address this issue at scale in Atlanta. If you really want to get at this, at the scale of what Atlanta is facing, guess who you need on your team? Right? And it doesn't mean you can't have lots of other nonprofit developers and other developers, but the folks who have the scale and resources to do what needs to get done are these developers. And so that is not terribly productive. So what I would say to folks is, yes, there needs to be a villain in the story, but the villain in the story is the sort of inequitable systems. That's the villain. The villain is that we've created a construct around the housing market in Atlanta that privileges some folks, that makes it possible for them to use housing as a wealth building engine, to pass on intergenerational wealth to their children and do all that kind of stuff. And we've created another secondary market for folks who get none of that privilege, right? And are forced to serve in sort of perpetual hardship over and over again because they don't get the benefits of a housing market that is working in their favor. And I would say across the country, there are many localities, cities, towns, counties who are doing exactly that, like pulling every single one of the city's policies and saying, does this serve us well? Does this serve to bring more equity to our community? And if it doesn't, we're going to redesign it.
So you acknowledge that this past year has been a tough one for a lot of people with the COVID-19 pandemic. We've also seen racial justice uprisings. How have these things impacted this landscape?
Yeah, I would say, one of the things that I think folks in the housing community have struggled with for many years and are just getting our grounding in terms of having a real strong conversation about issues of racial equity and racial justice. Some would call the combination of those housing justice, and it's being powered by the fallout from COVID-19, with so many people facing eviction or facing job loss, and not being able to maintain even the little bit of housing that they have. Folks are getting, I would say, radicalized, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but radicalized in terms of like something has to happen. We're not going to allow this many people to be in the street because we're not providing a way for folks to make a living and have a home. So what I would say about this to me is an opportunity for us to actually address some of these issues that have been on the table for years, but we've kind of not been willing to have that conversation. From my vantage point, this is the moment to have that conversation. We will probably not get a better moment to have that conversation. So for those who sort of been saying, I don't know, it's hard in Atlanta to have this kind of conversation. It's, right. I would say dispense with that. This is the moment. Let's have it. Let's do it.
That's Dr. Tiffany Manuel, President and CEO of The Case Made. Housing affordability, it's a big old issue here in Metro Atlanta and all over the country. And it's good to have some new ideas for how to talk about it. And if this episode has helped you to make that connection about why this issue matters in your life, I have a suggestion for you: the Atlanta Regional Housing Forums. These are gatherings a few times a year at which folks working for housing affordability have really enlightening conversations all about the many topics related to this key issue. It's a collaborative effort of more than 20 organizations, and it's led by ARC and the Atlanta Neighborhood Development Partnership. We'll provide a link to the housing forums in our show notes on the page for this episode. You can find that at whatsnextatl.org/podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please share it with others you think would like it too, and give us a good rating on Apple Podcasts. Thanks. That's it for now. See ya.